If you're over 50 and you drive, the DVLA has quietly started asking you questions it never used to ask. No headline, no letter through the door with a red stamp on it, just a new box on the renewal form and a new set of expectations sitting underneath the surface. Let's get into exactly what's real, what's still being decided, and what you actually need to check this week. Start with the one date that matters most if you're over 70, because this is the part almost nobody explains properly. Once you turn 70, your license stops working the way it used to. It no longer just sits there quietly for 10 years. From that birthday onwards, you're on a 3-year clock, every single time, for the rest of your driving life. The DVLA sends you a form called the D46P around 90 days before your 70th birthday. And if it doesn't turn up, that's on you to chase, not on them to remind you twice. Miss it, and you're not just late, you're not legally allowed to drive at all until the new license comes through. That's not a fine waiting to happen, that's driving with no license, full stop. Now here's where it gets interesting for anyone in their 50s watching this and thinking, that's not me yet. Reports circulating this year point to the DVLA rolling out something new at the 55 mark, well before the old 70-year-old milestone. It's being described as a voluntary health declaration, sitting inside the normal 10-year photo card renewal, rather than replacing it. Practically, that means when you renew in your 50s, you may now see an expanded fitness to drive section, asking you to actively confirm you've reviewed the current list of reportable conditions, rather than just ticking a box and moving on. I want to be straight with you, because a lot of channels won't be. This is still being described as voluntary at this stage, not a compulsory medical exam, and I'd treat it as an early-stage shift in tone rather than a hard new law you'll be prosecuted for ignoring. But voluntary today has a habit of becoming expected tomorrow, and turning up to that section of the form with no idea what it's asking is exactly how people get flagged for a follow-up review they didn't see coming. Which brings us to the part that's actually been through a formal government process, not just media speculation. In January this year, the Department for Transport opened a full public consultation on scrapping the current system entirely for older drivers. Right now, when you hit 70, you self-declare your eyesight is fine. Nobody checks. You tick a box saying you can read a number plate from 20 meters, and the DVLA takes your word for it. The consultation asked a blunt question. Should that stop? Should drivers instead be required to produce actual proof of a recent eyesight test before their license gets renewed? It also asked, who should be responsible for telling the DVLA if your eyesight drops below standard? You or the optician who just tested you? That consultation closed on the 11th of May. We are now well past that date, and the honest answer is, the outcome hasn't been published yet. So if you've seen a video or an article telling you mandatory eye tests are already law, that's ahead of the actual timeline. What we do know is the pressure behind this is real, and it isn't going away. Freedom of Information data released this year showed almost 20,000 licenses pulled for eyesight problems in the space of 3 years, and collisions linked to poor eyesight rising by over a quarter in the last 12 months alone. A quarter of drivers surveyed said they'd had a near miss they put down to their own vision. That's the backdrop the government is working from, and it's exactly why so many people expect this consultation to land as a real rule change, possibly before the year is out. Let's talk about why the self-declaration system exists in the first place, and why it's under so much pressure right now. The UK is one of only 3 countries in Europe that still lets drivers mark their own homework on eyesight. Everywhere else, someone independent checks. That's been fine for decades on the assumption that people are broadly honest about their own vision. But vision loss is sneaky. It creeps in gradually, and plenty of people genuinely don't notice how much they've lost until someone else points it out, which is a very different problem to someone deliberately lying on a form. That's part of why campaigners pushing this consultation aren't just targeting the over 70s either. Their argument is that vision problems start well before 70 for a lot of people, and a policy that only catches drivers at that one age misses a huge chunk of the actual risk on the road. Now, alongside all of this, the DVLA is quietly getting better at catching the people who don't update their details at all, regardless of age. Automatic number plate recognition is now tightly linked into DVLA databases, and that link is only getting stronger. If your address is wrong, if a medical condition isn't logged, if anything on record doesn't match reality, that gap is far more visible to the system than it used to be. Fines for outdated details can run up to £1,000, And that's before you factor in what happens to your insurance if you're ever in a collision and it turns out your details or your medical history weren't accurate at the time. Speaking of insurance, there's a data sharing shift worth knowing about if you're over 50 and shopping around for cover. New protocols mean insurers can, in some cases, see whether you've engaged with these voluntary health declarations at all. The stated aim from the DVLA and the government is road safety, not profiling drivers by age. But consumer groups are watching this closely because the practical worry is obvious. Nobody wants to be honest about a minor health note on a form and then get quietly punished for it on their premium. If you're in this age bracket, it's worth shopping around at renewal rather than assuming your current insurer is giving you the best deal, because specialist policies aimed at experienced 50-plus drivers are increasingly factoring in exactly this kind of data. While we're on the subject of what counts as a notifiable condition, this list has been getting more attention lately, and it applies at any age, not just once you hit a milestone birthday. Glaucoma, early-stage Parkinson's, certain forms of diabetes, anything affecting your vision, your consciousness, or your physical ability to control a vehicle. You are legally required to tell the DVLA the moment a relevant condition develops or worsens, not at your next renewal, not when it's convenient. Sit on it, and you're looking at fines up to £1,000, and if you're ever in an accident afterwards, an undeclared condition can unravel your insurance entirely, leaving you personally exposed for damages that would otherwise have been covered. Now, here's a genuinely useful thing the DVLA has actually built that's worth using regardless of your age. It's called View My Driver Record, an online portal where you can check exactly what the DVLA currently holds against your name. Your entitlements, your renewal dates, any conditions logged. For a lot of people in their 50s and 60s, this is the first time they've actually looked at what's on file since they passed their test decades ago. And it's a 5-minute job that tells you immediately if anything needs fixing before it becomes a problem. There's also a physical side to this that opticians have started pushing harder, even outside of any new legal requirement. Bringing along a recent prescription, ideally issued within the last 2 years, when you renew your photo card. It's not mandatory yet under the base rules, but if the self-declaration system does eventually tighten up the way the consultation suggests, having that paperwork ready puts you ahead, rather than scrambling for an appointment at the last minute. And honestly, whatever the DVLA ends up deciding, getting your eyes checked every 2 years is just sensible regardless of what's written in the regulations. Half the people who fail these checks had no idea anything had changed until someone else pointed it out. If you're over 60, you're already entitled to a free NHS eye test every 2 years, so there's genuinely no excuse for putting it off. And it's one of the few things in this entire video that costs you nothing and only takes half an hour out of your day. While we're on practical steps, it's worth knowing what actually happens if your medical renewal doesn't come through in time, because this trips up more people than you'd expect. Provided you send off a complete and correct application before your existing license expired, you're generally allowed to keep driving while the DVLA processes it, as long as you haven't been told otherwise and you still meet the medical standards. But that protection only kicks in if your paperwork was actually correct and submitted on time. Send it late, or send it with gaps in the medical section, and that safety net disappears. Processing times have been running longer than they should this year too, with some drivers reporting waits well beyond the usual time frame when a medical condition needs a specialist review. So building in extra weeks rather than applying at the last possible moment is not just sensible, it's becoming necessary. It's also worth touching on how this connects to the wider digital shift happening across the DVLA right now, because it changes how you'll eventually interact with all of this. The government is rolling out a digital driving license through something called the gov.uk wallet, letting you carry your license on your phone alongside your physical card. Right now, it's still in a phased rollout, with provisional and younger drivers first in line. So if you're in your 50s or 60s, don't expect this to replace your photo card anytime soon. Your physical card remains fully valid, and there's no announced date for phasing it out. But the direction matters here too, because a digital record makes it far easier for the DVLA to flag inconsistencies automatically, rather than waiting for a human to catch them at renewal. The same modernization drive sits behind a new medical casework system and a digital medical services portal, both aimed at speeding up exactly the kind of health-related renewal that affects this age group most. One more thing worth flagging briefly, even though it's aimed at a younger crowd, because plenty of you have grandchildren or adult children learning to drive right now. Booking a driving test has become far more restrictive this year. Learners are now limited to 2 changes on an existing booking. Only the learner themselves can book, cancel, or move their own test, and instructors can no longer bulk book slots on someone's behalf. If there's a learner in your family who assumed the old flexible system still applied, it's worth a 5-minute conversation, because losing a test slot over an outdated assumption is an easy thing to avoid once you know the rule exists. Let's zoom out for a second, because I don't want this to feel like a wall of separate rules with no thread connecting them. The direction of travel here is consistent, whether we're talking about the over 55 voluntary declaration, the over 70 consultation on eyesight proof, or the tighter data sharing with insurers. The DVLA is moving away from simply trusting what drivers tell it and moving toward independently checking it. None of that is confirmed as fully locked in law yet for the middle age brackets, but the pattern is clear enough that treating it as inevitable is a reasonable bet, not paranoia. So here's what I'd actually do if you're in this age bracket watching this. Log into your DVLA account today and check View My Driver Record. It takes 5 minutes and tells you if anything is out of date. If you're anywhere near 55 and do a photo card renewal, expect to see that expanded fitness to drive section. And don't just click through it without reading what it's actually asking. If you're approaching 70, mark that 90-day window before your birthday, because the D46P not landing in your post is not a valid excuse to keep driving past expiry. And regardless of your age, if anything about your health has changed since you last renewed, whether it's your eyesight, a new diagnosis, or medication that affects your driving, that's a DVLA phone call today, not a job for your next renewal cycle. None of this is designed to frighten you off driving. The DVLA's own position is that these checks exist to keep experienced drivers safely on the road for longer, not to push people off it the moment they hit a certain birthday. But the system is shifting from taking your word for it to actually checking, and the people who get caught out are almost always the ones who assumed the old rules still applied. If this cleared up what's actually confirmed and what's still sitting in consultation, hit subscribe, because the eyesight testing outcome is expected to land before the year is out, and I'll be breaking it down the moment it does. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one.